Good afternoon. This is the American presidency class, and the uh, session that we're about to initiate pertains to part 4 of the President and the Constitution. What we will be talking about today is the method of selecting the president as opposed to uh, the previous discussions concerning the power of the presidency. So moving from power in earlier sessions, we're going to talk about how the president is given his office. And so in this discussion, we'll talk about what's in the Constitution about presidential selection. And then we will talk about how this has changed through time up to the present, including the 25th Amendment. And we'll talk about some of the mishaps that have occurred in presidential selection through time, including assassinations and cases where presidents were selected but weren't the popular vote choice. So there were also cases where there was no vice presidency through much of the 19th century and even into the 20th century. There was no vice presidency. Also, we'll review the cases where presidents have died in office and what happened with the presidency during those periods when presidents died. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and share the screen with my computer. And okay, so we're here at the presidency and the Constitution, part 4. So let's move to the first slide. This is obviously about choosing the president. What does the Constitution say about that? In Article 1, Section 2, notice this is the legislative article. The text reads, "Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be president, if such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed." Note the condition majority there rather than the plurality. "And if there be more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president." Two things I'd like you to note about Article 1, Section 2. One is that there's no provision here for political parties. So you would think if there is a party and the president and vice president received an equal number of votes, then either of them could become president under this article. Second concerns the word majority here. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, but if there is more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the House shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for president. And if no person have a majority, that is, if somebody has a plurality but no majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president. This created problems in the 1800 election when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had an equal number of electoral votes, being representatives of the same political party. And it became a real problem in 1824 when John Quincy Adams became president over Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote, but he did not have a majority of the popular vote. He only had a plurality of the popular vote. And so this threw the election to the House, where 5 candidates were selected from, and the person chosen did not have the majority of the popular vote. Of course, this led to a sort of an illegitimacy claim on the part of the Jacksonians regarding the John Quincy Adams presidency. So this is an important article and led to problems early on. Both at the Constitutional Convention, both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan advocated choosing the chief executive by the legislative branch. In other words, the Congress would choose the president. How radical was this idea? Well, not very radical at all, as a matter of fact. It seems foreign to us living in our current republic, but it was not foreign at the time, and it's not foreign today. In all parliamentary democracies, the chief executive is chosen by the legislative branch. And so this was not a radical proposal at all. In fact, the United States is the only stable democracy in the world that chooses their chief executive through an electoral college rather than through the legislature. All other major democracies that are stable are parliamentary democracies or partial parliamentary democracies. And my colleague, Chabub here in the political science department has an article published at Harvard on this topic. I've got it hot linked here so you can read about the parliamentary democracies and the listing that he gives there. Okay, so why an electoral college and not a popular vote? A popular vote was considered at the convention. However, as we talked about earlier, the framers were very skeptical of democracy and of the trustworthiness of the people in choosing a president. The people were likely to choose someone who was threatening to the property class or could be duped. And if you want evidence of that, go to the remarks by Jerry on Elbridge Gerry on July 25th. Let's look at that briefly here. Okay, Mr. Gerry repeated his remark that an election by at all by the national legislature was radically and incurably wrong, and moved that the executive be appointed by the governors and presidents of the states with the advice of their councils, and where there are no councils, by electors chosen by the legislatures, the executives to vote in the following proportions, and so forth there. And then later, here's what I was looking for. Mr. Gerry, a popular election in this case is radically vicious. The ignorance of the people would put it in the power of some one set of men dispersed through the Union and acting in concert to delude them into any appointment. He observed that such a society of men existed in the order of Cincinnati. They are respectable, united, and influential. They will, in fact, elect the chief magistrate in every instance if the election be referred to the people. His respect for the characters composing the society could not bind him to the danger and impropriety of throwing such power into their hands. So he's radically opposed. He thinks direct democracy is radically vicious, is what he says. There were also concerns among the founders about illicit influence from legislative conniving and or foreign powers. And if we look at the documents here, let's look at Madison and Gerry. Okay, so Madison goes into this right here. Okay, and he says in the second place, the candidate would intrigue with the legislature, would derive his appointment from the predominant faction, and be apt to render his administration to his views. In the third place, ministers of foreign powers. The ministers of foreign powers would have and would make use of opportunity to mix their intrigues and influence with the election. Limited as the powers of the executive are, it will be an object of great moment with the rival powers of Europe who have American possessions to have that they're at the head of our government a man attached to their respective politics and interests. No pains nor perhaps expense will be spared to gain from the legislature an appointment favorable to their wishes. And he goes on to be specific about how this has happened in other countries. And the later Mr. Butler says, the two great evils to be avoided are a cabal at home and influence from abroad. It will be difficult to avoid either if the election be made by the national legislature. On the other hand, the government should not be made so complex and unwieldy as to disgust the states. And so you see evidence here that the Constitutional Convention and Madison's notes at the Constitutional Convention imply that there was great concern among the delegates that a foreign power would interfere in the American election. And of course, this is obviously relevant given the claims and charges that the 2016 election was subject to interference by the Russians. Note also that it was not foreign at that time either. In the 1796 election, in which John Adams was elected, there was a claim that the French were attempting to interfere in the election, and so this is something that has been a concern throughout American history. Direct popular election would also favor populous states over non-populous states, in the sense that the populous state has more citizens than the non-populous state does. And you can see evidence of this discussion in Madison's notes on July 25th. We won't go there this time, but you can look at the discussion by Madison and later by Ellsworth on July 25th about the concern about favoring the large states over the small states. Relatedly, there was also the issue of southern slaveholding states. Slaves were a large part of the population in the southern states, but slaves could not vote, rendering the choice by popular election likely to be dominated by the North. Southerners understood that they were disadvantaged by popular election, and the use of an electoral college alleviated their worries because they had already agreed to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for census purposes. And we looked at this last time, but it bears use to look at it again. This is Madison's discussion of this point on July 19th. Okay, so we want to see Madison here. Okay, here's the segment from Madison. He says, and this is just part of what he's talking about here. There was one difficulty, however, of a serious nature attending an immediate choice by the people. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to the fewest objections. So slavery was a big concern here, and the use of an electoral college came about as a result of wanting to satisfy, satiate, if you will, the southern states on account of the population difference between the two regions. Under the Constitution, states determine the manner of selection for the electors. And if you read the notes of the Constitutional Convention, you'll see that there was a considerable discussion of how the electors should be selected. Hamilton proposed a district plan, which we're going to talk about in a second. But others wanted to leave it up to the states as to how the selection of the electors should occur. And in 1789, a large popular vote, at-large popular vote, the winner-take-all method started in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Virginia and Delaware used a district plan by popular vote, and in the 5 other states, the state legislatures chose the electors. So you see, in the beginning, there was a lot of diversity among the states in how the electors were chosen. At-large popular vote with winner-take-all methods in 2 states. 2 states, Virginia and Delaware, used the district plan by popular vote, and in the 5 other states, the state legislatures chose. You might ask the question, well, wait a minute, that's only 9 states. At this point, the Constitution had not been fully ratified, and so there were states that were not participating in the 1789 presidential election. So beginning in 1804, after the 12th Amendment, there was a definite trend towards the winner-take-all system for a statewide popular vote. By 1832, only South Carolina used the state legislature, and it abandoned that method after 1860, the start of the Civil War. Since 1836, the statewide winner-take-all popular vote for electors has been the almost universal practice. Currently, Maine since 1972 and Nebraska since 1996 use the district plan with 2 at-large electors going for the statewide popular vote winner. So you might ask, what is the district plan? The district plan, I've got hot linked here. You can read about it, but I will synthesize that. It was first proposed by Alexander Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention. What he proposed was that each state be divided into districts based on their population, and each state would get 2 at-large electors, and the winners in the representational districts would each have an elector, and to that elector from each district in the state, you would add the 2 for the senators. And so Hamilton's district plan was something that was used sparsely in the beginning, and it's still used sparsely today. It is a viable alternative to the Electoral College. It would require a constitutional amendment in order to move to Hamilton's district plan from the winner-take-all method that we use today in almost every state. Of course, this is important because presidential elections, there have been 5 cases in U.S. history where the winner of the election, who won the most electoral votes, actually lost the popular vote. The first of these was in 1824. In 1824, John Quincy Adams won the Electoral College over Andrew Jackson, but he had 38,000 fewer popular votes than Jackson did, and this was 10.44% of the popular vote. It happened again in 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes winning the electoral vote over Samuel Tilden. Tilden got 253,000 more votes than did Rutherford Hayes. That was 3% of the electorate. 1888, it happened again with Benjamin Harrison winning the electoral vote over Grover Cleveland. You may or may not remember that Grover Cleveland had been president since 1884. He was defeated in 1888 by the electoral vote, but then he became president again in 1892. And so he had a split presidency. And then more recently for me, probably not for many of you, in 2000, George W. Bush won the electoral vote over Al Gore. Al Gore won the election popular vote by 544,000 votes, which was 0.5%. And then finally, the latest time that this has happened was in 2016. We're all very familiar with this. Donald Trump won the electoral vote over Hillary Clinton. Clinton received almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, which was 2.1% of the electorate. And so you can see that the Electoral College is perverse, if you will, to democracy. Nevertheless, that's the way it is done in the United States. In each of these cases, all 5 cases, the election outcome was very contentious, and the winner was perceived by the other party as illegitimate. This, of course, crippled the administration, the execution by the person, the president who won, but did not win the popular vote. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution talks about qualifications. No person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president. Neither shall any president be eligible to that office who shall not attain the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident within the United States. There's a nice article on this section at the Heritage Foundation. We won't go there, but I encourage you to read it. The requirements for the age requirement for becoming president is greater than the age requirement for becoming a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. To be a senator, one needs only to be 30 years old. And so presidents assumedly would have greater wisdom than ordinary citizens. Now, the age of 35 years old in 1789 was fairly old. The lifespan of Americans was much shorter than it is now, and so this is a mature individual who is being elected president at the age of 35. The clause natural born citizen. The candidate needs to be a natural born citizen. This has been a matter of contention and a matter of controversy many times through the years, with the last time it being a matter for contention was when Mitt Romney ran for president in 2012. Romney, of course, was born in Mexico, but he was born a child of a citizen of the United States. And so he was, by virtue of the fact that his parents were citizens, a natural born citizen, even though he had been born in Mexico. And then finally the 14 years a resident within the United States. This is intended to assure that somebody hasn't been abroad for a long time, been converted or been subverted to be loyal to another country. Rather, the person needs to have been in the United States as a resident for a long period of time. So, contrary to common perception, Alexander Hamilton was actually eligible to run for president. He was not a natural-born citizen, born in the West Indies. Nevertheless, he was eligible to run for president because he had been a resident of the United States for 14 years, and also because, let's go back here, he had been a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution. In fact, he was very influential in the adoption of the Constitution. So Hamilton was eligible to run for president, even though he hadn't been born in the United States. though he was probably unelectable due to his scandalous behavior. He had carried on a long-running affair, illicit affair with a married woman, and he was blackmailed by her husband, who was a noted scalawag. Note also that it was Thomas Jefferson who outed him in this illicit behavior. However, Arnold Schwarzenegger is not eligible to run for the presidency. Why not? Arnold Schwarzenegger was not a natural born citizen of the United States, and he was not around at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. So even though he might be a good candidate for the Republican Party, he's not eligible to run for president. It was understood at the Constitutional Convention and across the whole nation that George Washington would be the first president. He did not seek the office, but he reluctantly agreed to serve. He had a lot of prestige, and he evoked a lot of trust from his fellow citizens. Otherwise, the powers allocated to the first president would likely have been a lot more limited. There were no political parties at the time of the Constitutional Convention and for several years after that. It was just expected that men of good faith and qualifications would be put forth to fill the role of chief executive. The person with the most electoral votes would become president, and with the person with the second most electoral votes would become vice president. While there were no political parties at the time of the first election, there was the origin of faction at the time of the Constitutional Convention and at ratification. One faction, the Federalists, favored a strong federal government. This faction consisted basically of those favoring the business and commercial interests of the northern states. An anti-federalist faction, which was later called the Democratic Republican Party, no relationship to the modern Republican Party, favored a more restrictive role for the national government. This faction basically reflected the interests of southern states who wanted to maintain slavery and states' rights. The inauguration of George Washington as the first president of the United States came on April 30th of 1789 on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, New York. With his inauguration, the executive branch of the United States government officially started operating under the new government established by the 1787 Constitution. At this time, two states had not yet ratified the Constitution. These were North Carolina and Rhode Island. During the ratification process, a Bill of Rights had been promised, but North Carolina held out for final approval of a Bill of Rights. George Washington worked closely with James Madison, the first Speaker of the House of Representatives and Washington's confidential advisor, to craft a Bill of Rights. In September of 1789, Madison was able to win agreement for 12 amendments to submit to the states. When I say win agreement, I mean both the House and the Senate voted in favor of the 12 amendments. The 10 that the majority of the states approved constitute what we now know as the Bill of Rights. 2 of Madison's amendments failed, and you can go to the hot link that I've got here to see what those 2 amendments consisted of. So I encourage you to do that. Soon after ratifying the Bill of Rights, North Carolina ratified the new Constitution. Rhode Island did the same during the next year. The 10 amendments that we call the Bill of Rights limited Congress and the president relative to the states. So when we think of presidential power in this context, the 10 amendments are limits on presidential power. The amendments can be thought of as a compromise between those wanting a much weaker federal government and those wanting a vigorous government pursuing a common national purpose. The 10th Amendment sought to limit federal power generally and was a compromise to the weak central government faction. And for a discussion of that, you can go to the hot link that I've got shown here. There are those who argue that the 10th Amendment limits the powers of the national government to those expressly delineated in the Constitution. Note the word I use here, expressly. However, a reading of the history of this amendment suggests otherwise. After the Constitution was ratified, but before we had a Bill of Rights, South Carolina Representative Thomas Tudor Tucker and Massachusetts Representatives Elbridge Gerry separately proposed similar amendments limiting the federal government to powers expressly delegated, which would have denied the doctrine of implied powers. James Madison opposed these amendments, stating it was impossible to confine a government to the exercise of express powers. There must necessarily be admitted powers by implication, unless the Constitution descended to recount every power in minutia. When a vote on the version of the amendment using the word expressly delegated was defeated, Connecticut Representative Roger Sherman drafted the 10th Amendment in its ratified form, omitting the word expressly. Sherman's language allowed for an expansive reading of the powers implied by the necessary and proper clause. In other words, there are implied powers that are not specifically delineated in the Constitution. And you can see a discussion of this at the hot link that I've got here. So in other words, the 10th Amendment does not limit the power of the national government with respect to the states. And the discussion during this ratification period is important here. For the president, see especially Amendments 3, 4, and 5, where Amendment 3 pertains to quartering of soldiers. Amendment 4 pertains to unlawful search and seizure, and Amendment 5 pertains to military law and due process and compensation for property seizure. And if you want to see a discussion of this, the effect of these amendments on presidential power, then you can go to the hot link that I've got shown on the screen. Various later constitutional amendments also constrain presidential power. These include the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection of the laws, as well as term limits imposed by the 22nd Amendment. This amendment was ratified in 1951. See a discussion of that at the hot link that I have below this link, below this bullet. The dates for the president's term in office has changed through time. Originally, the inauguration date was March 4th. This was changed to January 20th, starting with Roosevelt's second term. And it's now formally established by the 20th Amendment, which was ratified in 1933. Okay, go to the hot link there if you want to read the 20th Amendment in its entirety. Presidential power, as we will show as we go through the next module, has expanded consistently over time. Maybe this is enabled by the generality of the executive article. It is important to understand that the framers did not anticipate or want a democratic government rooted in political parties. Rather, they wanted a government led by statesmen who were above the partisan fray. They wanted someone in office who would be more interested in representing the nation as a whole rather than a political party. In this regard, the Constitution they designed was flawed. Nevertheless, by the end of Washington's first term, two political parties had developed with well-articulated ideologies. Federalists, who designed the Constitution, were for a realist accommodation with England and against atheistic France. Federalists advanced an ambitious national agenda of economic development and social development that required a vigorous central government. The North was a stronghold of Federalist strength, and they envisioned a nation centered on manufacturing and exports, with Western expansion inevitable to accommodate business expansion and raw materials. Democratic Republicans, also called the Anti-Federalists in the beginning, were for revolutionary France and against the hated monarchical England. Democratic Republicans were for a weak and strictly limited central government. The South was a stronghold of their strength, and they envisioned an agrarian, rural, and relaxed lifestyle. The wage slavery of factories was disdained in favor of human bondage to support that lifestyle. Partisan newspapers had developed by the end of Washington's first term. These partisan differences led to difficulties concerning the method of selecting the president early on. As noted earlier, Article 2, Section 1 says, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in which the state may be entitled in Congress. The Constitution then goes on to state the method by which the electors would select the president. Originally, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 stated that the electors voted for two persons for president rather than one vote for president and another vote for vice president. So in 1796, this is the first time we ran into problems with the original Constitution. John Adams, who was a Federalist, was selected as president, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, was selected as vice president. Needless to say, it was a very tumultuous presidency, with Jefferson and Madison leading an opposition to John Adams. So the vice president was not on board with the same political party. And note that political parties had begun to emerge during the Washington administration around 1793 or so. Then in 1800, a problem arose again. The vote for president and vice president was tied, with Jefferson and Aaron Burr both being Democratic Republicans. The party's intent was that Jefferson be the president and Burr be the vice president. However, Burr, with the help of the Federalists, tried to convince the House of Representatives to make him president. Note that the Federalists had decisively won the midterm elections in 1798 as the XYZ affair unfolded and the French Revolution became increasingly unpopular. So Federalists controlled the House of Representatives that was to break the deadlock. They also controlled the Senate at this point. Okay, so note also that the 1800 election was fairly close, with the additional Southern votes gained by the 3/5 compromise being decisive in electing Jefferson and Burr over Adams and Pinckney, the Federalist candidates. There were 35 ballots in the House of Representatives, still controlled by the Federalists until the newly elected Congress was seated, trying to break the deadlock between Jefferson and Burr. Federalists wanted to thwart Jefferson from being president. They preferred Burr over the hated Jefferson or even a Federalist in case of no agreement. Accordingly, the majority Federalist party in the House had attempted to persuade Democratic Republican electors to vote for Burr. Note that the framers had also blundered in not providing what would happen to the presidency in the case of a deadlock. Who would become president if the House could not decide between Jefferson and Byrd. Could they select a Federalist, say John Marshall, who had been Adams' Secretary of State? So the Constitution was clearly flawed in the method of selecting the president. Jefferson was finally selected president on the 36th ballot. Finally spurring this outcome was a set of Democratic Republican governors from the states of Pennsylvania and Virginia who prepared their militias to march on Washington. Massachusetts called up its militia for the Federalists. There was a real threat of civil war. If the hotheads had their way, the 1787 Constitution would at this point have disintegrated and a new constitutional convention would need to be called. The problem was resolved by the ratification of the 12th Amendment in 1804, which separated the president and vice presidential votes by party. From that point to the present, each partisan elector has cast one vote for president and another for vice president. Since this time, all presidential elections have been partisan in nature. If you want to read a lot more about these times and these developments, you should probably look at my book called The Myth of Presidential Representation, which discusses this at length. Again, this was not what the founders intended. They wanted statesmen to be president, people who would represent the nation at large and look out for the best interests of everyone, not partisans as president. However, there was little choice due to the development of political parties starting in the second Washington administration. So since 1804, we have largely had a winner-take-all electoral college system, which implies that many are not represented, and their votes are wasted in presidential elections. For example, if you come from California and you are a Republican, you might as well not even go to the ballot box. The reason being, Democrats are solidly in control of California. Similarly, in Texas, if you are a Democrat and you intend to vote, you might as well not do so because Republicans are solidly in control of Texas. Of course, the modern exceptions, as I noted earlier, to this winner-take-all system are Nebraska and Maine. So the resulting system has been imperfect from the standpoint of popular democracy. In 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and 2016, the Electoral College system resulted in the election of a president who did not even receive a plurality of the popular vote. In other words, the popular will has been perverted by the Electoral College system in about 1/9 of all presidencies. The method of presidential succession was also problematic and also changed through time. So again, the founders presumably blundered in their method of presidential succession. That is, when a president left office before the end of their term. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 states, in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president, and such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed, or a new president shall be elected. The word new I've inserted there for clarity. So in the beginning, then, the vice president would replace the president in case of death or resignation or inability. And if both had pursued that path, then it was up to the the Congress to decide by law who would replace the removed or missing official. About 1 in 5 American presidents have left office due to death from one cause or another. In other words, about 8 out of 45 presidents have left due to death. 4 U.S. presidents were assassinated while in office. These were Lincoln in 1865, assassinated by a Confederate sympathizer. Garfield in 1881, assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. William McKinley in 1901 was assassinated by an anarchist, and John F. Kennedy in 1963 assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald because, who knows, the mob, that's one theory. Cuba, another theory. The Soviet Union, yet another theory. That mystery has never been resolved. However, there have been many, many other attempts to assassinate presidents, including documented attempts on Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Richard Nixon, twice, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump during the election campaign. You can go to the Wikipedia article that I've got here for more discussion of these assassination attempts. Additionally, 4 presidents have died of natural causes while in office. These were William Henry Harrison in 1841. He served only 31 days. Zachary Taylor in 1850, Warren G. Harding in 1923, and Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia after giving the longest inaugural address in American history, over 2 hours long, on a cold, rainy day with no overcoat or hat, and after having ridden to the inauguration on horseback and riding through the streets for the inaugural parade. Zachary Taylor served 16 months rather, after consuming copious amounts of raw fruit and iced milk. The cause of death was an intestinal ailment, which also, food poisoning in other words, which also struck some members of the cabinet. However, some would allege that he was a victim of foul play, that is, he was poisoned intentionally. Almost immediately after his death, rumors started to circulate that Taylor was poisoned by pro-slavery Southerners, and similar theories continued into the 21st century. His remains were exhumed and autopsied in 1991, and no evidence was found that he was poisoned. So he died of food poisoning. Warren G. Harding died 30 months into his presidency after an exhausting trip west to California, Alaska, and Canada. He collapsed from exhaustion in late July and was diagnosed with a heart condition and pneumonia. His stated cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage, that is, a stroke. However, rumors persist that he was poisoned by his wife. Harding had well-known extramarital affairs and an illegitimate child. His wife refused an autopsy and destroyed all of his papers after his death. And so we have a mystery there on whether or not Harding was poisoned or whether he died of stroke. Franklin Roosevelt died a little over 2 months into his 4th term on April 12th of 1945 from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, that is a stroke. Of course, he always had health problems, but he maintained a very active schedule. He had recently attended the Yalta Conference in Crimea and was in the midst of negotiations over what would happen after World War II. Prior to the 25th Amendment, which was ratified in 1967, there were many times when there was no vice president, including after a presidential assassination or after a vice president died or resigned. The Constitution was flawed original Constitution was flawed in the sense that it made no provision for a vice president after a president left office before the end of his term. And you can see a list of the times when the office of the vice presidency was vacant by going to the hot link that I have at this bullet. The Constitution and various presidential succession acts provided for how the president would be replaced if incapacitated. However, there was no mention in the Constitution of how a vice president would be replaced upon leaving the office for whatever reason until 1967. Hence, the office was left vacant many times during the 19th and into the 20th century. The urgency of the 25th Amendment was because Lyndon Johnson assumed office after the Kennedy assassination and had no vice president, as had occurred many times earlier. During the period between the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963, and January 20th, 1965, Lyndon Johnson had no vice president. It was not until after the 1964 election that re-elected Lyndon Johnson and his inauguration that Hubert Humphrey was sworn in as vice president. The order of succession is mentioned in 3 places in the Constitution. As we talked about earlier, it's mentioned in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, and it's also mentioned in the 20th Amendment and the 25th Amendment. The 20th Amendment states, if at the time fixed for the beginning of the term of president, the president-elect shall have died, the vice president-elect shall become president. If a president shall not have been chosen before the time fixed for the beginning of his term, or if the president-elect shall have failed to qualify, then the vice president-elect shall act as president until the president shall have qualified. And the Congress may by law provide for the case wherein neither a president-elect nor a vice president-elect shall have qualified, declaring who shall then act as president, or the manner in which one who is to act shall be selected, and such person shall act accordingly until the president or vice president shall have been qualified. The 25th Amendment prescribes the current order of presidential succession in case of presidential or vice presidential disability. The vice president succeeds the president. The vice presidential slot is filled by nomination and Senate ratification. Gerald Ford was the first to become vice president under this procedure. What had happened was that Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's vice president, had been forced to resign because he was convicted of a crime in his home state. And the crime was bribery in his home state. And so he made a plea bargain in which he would resign as vice president to receive a more lenient sentence in the crime he had been convicted of. Ford, as I said, was the first to become vice president under this procedure, but he later became president. And this was because of Richard Nixon's resignation from the presidency, again, due to a crime that he had committed, the burglary of the Watergate. This is the only time this amendment has been needed. The 25th Amendment, Section 1, in case of removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Section 2, whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. Section 3, whenever the president transmits to the president pro tem of the Senate and Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that he is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, and until he transmits to them a written declaration to the contrary, such powers and duties shall be discharged by the vice president as acting president. Section 4 has recently become relevant. Let me read it and then we'll talk about why it's become relevant. Whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit to the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The Vice President shall immediately assume the powers and duties of the office of the acting president as acting president. Thereafter, when the President transmits to the pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the Vice President and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit within 4 days to the President pro tem of the Senate and Speaker of the House of Representatives their written declaration that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Thereupon, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress within 21 days after receipt of the latter written declaration, or if Congress is not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to assemble, determines by 2/3 vote of both houses that the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the Vice President shall continue to discharge the same as acting President. Otherwise, the President shall resume the powers and duties of his office. Why is this relevant now? The 25th Amendment in that section provides another way in which the President can be removed from office beyond impeachment. Though this path would be very difficult if you read through all the requirements. It became relevant recently, relatively recently, when it was suggested that there was a plot or a plan within the Trump administration to declare the President unfit for office and to invoke the previous section of the 25th Amendment as a way to remove Trump from office. Of course, it never came about, and it would be very difficult for it to come about. So, as authorized under Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 gives the order of succession if there are multiple disabilities. That is, the President and the Vice President are disabled. The order of succession is President, Vice President, Speaker of the House, President pro tem of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, then through the entire cabinet. Earlier, the Presidential Succession Acts of 1792 and 1886 were also in effect until they were superseded. And if you want to read more about that, go to the hot link that I have here below this bullet. As you can see, we have completed the prepared lecture materials for Part 4 of the President and the Constitution. In this session, we have covered the mode for selecting the American President. We have outlined the constitutional provisions that dealt with selecting the President. We have noted that the original design for selecting the President was flawed, particularly as political parties developed in our system. And we've shown how revisions occurred to the mode for selecting the President. We have also discussed the mode of presidential succession in case the presidents are assassinated or die while in office or resign while in office. We need to have a successor to the president. Through much of the 19th century, there was no vice president, and indeed there was no vice president after a president left office, which happened quite frequently until after 1967. And so we've discussed that. We've also discussed the overarching theme that the founders were they produced a flawed plan for selecting the president, and we've shown what those flaws were from the case in 1796 of having a president and a vice president of two different political parties, the case in the election of 1800 where the Federalist Party was responsible for choosing a president between two Democratic Republicans. And then in 1824, we showed that the selection process was flawed, and that the electoral vote could actually fail to select a president. Nobody could get a majority of the electoral vote, but if they got a plurality of the electoral vote, then we would have a situation where the House could select between 5 different candidates for president. And so you can see the founders were imperfect in these regards. Okay, so we're looking forward to part 5 of this lecture sequence. Part 5 will deal with the founders' intentions with regard to the presidency. And we will talk about whether the founders would be happy with the modern presidency. This will tie in nicely with the debate on whether or not the founders would be approving of the modern presidency. And so we will stop now. I wish you happiness and health between now and our next class meeting. And so I'll sign off and wish you a fond farewell.